The Baja California desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast expanse of golden sands and rugged hills. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Four friends, Carlos, Ana, Javier, and Maria, were setting up camp for the night, excited for an adventure in one of Mexico's most mysterious and untamed regions. They had driven for hours, leaving behind the bustling city of Ensenada to find this remote spot deep in the desert. Carlos, the leader of the group, had been fascinated by the stories of the Baja Desert for years. Tales of ancient spirits, lost travelers, and strange apparitions had lured him to this desolate place. The others, though skeptical, were eager to escape the grind of daily life and experience something new. As they pitched their tents and prepared a small fire, the desert's eerie silence enveloped them. There was no sound but the soft whisper of the wind and the occasional rustle of sand. The vastness of the desert made them feel small, insignificant, and vulnerable. "Do you think the stories are true?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was the most superstitious of the group, always carrying a small charm for protection. Carlos shrugged, smiling. Who knows? But that's what makes this place so exciting, right? The unknown Javier chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. If we see any ghosts, we'll just offer them some of Anna's terrible cooking. Anna playfully swatted him, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The desert's oppressive stillness was beginning to weigh on her. Very funny, Javier. But seriously, let's just enjoy the night. It's not every day we get to camp in a place like this. As night fell, the desert transformed. The heat of the day gave way to a chilling cold, and the sky filled with stars. The friends gathered around the fire, its warmth and light a small comfort against the vast darkness surrounding them. They shared stories, laughed, and tried to ignore the creeping unease that gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the desert like a mournful cry. The fire flickered and danced, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. Maria shivered and moved closer to the flames, clutching her charm tightly. "Did you hear that?" Anna suddenly asked, her eyes wide. The others fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the wind, but then they heard a faint, distant wail that seemed to rise and fall with the gusts. It was an unnatural sound, like the cries of something not quite human. Carlos frowned, trying to rationalize it. It's probably just the wind. The desert can play tricks on your ears, especially at night, but the wail grew louder, more insistent, and now it seemed to echo from all around them. The friends exchanged nervous glances, the earlier bravado fading quickly. "Maybe we should check it out," Javier suggested, though his voice trembled slightly. "Are you crazy?" Maria hissed. "What if it's something dangerous?" Carlos stood, grabbing a flashlight. "We won't go far. Just a quick look to see if there's anything out there." But reluctantly, the others followed him, leaving the safety of the fire behind. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the sand and rocks ahead. The wailing grew louder as they walked, leading them deeper into the desert. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the top of a small dune. Below them, the ground seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, and for a moment they thought they saw figures moving in the distance, shadowy shapes that flitted across the sands. "What? What is that?" Ana whispered, her heart pounding. Carlos squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "I don't know. But it looks like," people as they watched, the figures grew clearer. They were dressed in old, tattered clothes, their faces gaunt and hollow. The wailing seemed to come from them, a chorus of despair that chilled the friends to the bone. "Their spirits," Maria said, her voice trembling with fear. "Spirits of those who died in the desert, lost and never found." The figure seemed to notice them now, turning their empty eyes toward the group. The wailing grew louder, almost deafening, and the air turned icy cold. The friends felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over them. "We need to go," Carlos said, his voice barely audible over the howls. Now they turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground in their haste. The wails followed them, growing louder and more frantic with each step. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they realized they had lost their bearings. The desert, so vast and featureless, seemed to swallow them whole. They ran blindly, desperate to escape the haunting cries that pursued them. Suddenly, Maria tripped and fell, crying out as she hit the ground. The others skidded to a stop, rushing to help her up. But when they looked back, they saw the figures closing in, their ghostly forms almost upon them. This way, Carlos shouted, pulling Maria to her feet. They veered to the right, hoping to find a way back to the campsite. The wails were all around them now, pressing in from every direction. As they crested another dune, they saw the faint glow of the campfire in the distance. Relief flooded through them, and they sprinted toward it, the spirits hot on their heels. They reached the camp just as the first of the figures broke over the dune behind them. Carlos grabbed a burning log from the fire and brandished it at the approaching spirits. Stay back. To their surprise, the figures hesitated, recoiling from the flames. The wailing lessened and the air grew warmer. Encouraged, the friends huddled close to the fire, using it as a barrier against the spirits. For hours they sat there, watching as the figures circled them, unable to come closer. The fire crackled and popped, its light a small beacon of hope in the darkness. Gradually the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night until only the wind remained. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the spirits were gone. The friends, exhausted and shaken, packed up their camp in silence. None of them spoke of what had happened as they drove back to Ensenada, the memory of the night too fresh, too terrifying. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of the city that Maria finally broke the silence. Do you think they'll follow us? Carlos shook his head, though he didn't sound convinced. I don't think so. I hope they're bound to the desert, but as they drove through the city, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. The wails of the spirits still echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of the horrors they had faced. In the end, they never spoke of the desert again, but they knew that the spirits were still out there, waiting in the vast expanse of sand and stone, ready to claim the souls of those foolish enough to venture into their domain. And they knew that they had been lucky to escape with their lives. In the heart of Oaxaca, a region known for its rich culture and dense, uncharted forests, a group of friends set out for what they hoped would be an unforgettable camping trip. The dense woods, shrouded in mist and mystery, offered the perfect escape from their busy urban lives. Little did they know, their adventure would turn into a nightmarish ordeal. The group consisted of Alex, the adventurous leader Maria, a historian fascinated by local legends Pedro, the pragmatic planner, and Elena, a nature lover eager for a break from the city's chaos. They arrived at their campsite deep in the forest, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The fading light painted the trees in eerie silhouettes, setting a foreboding tone. As they set up their tents and gathered around the campfire, Maria shared stories she had read about the area. According to local folklore, the forest was once the site of an ancient ritual performed by indigenous people meant to appease dark spirits that roamed the land. The ritual involved sacrifices and chants, and it was believed that those who disturbed the area might awaken these ancient spirits. Pedro, trying to lighten the mood, joked about the old legends. I think we'll be safe as long as we don't disturb any ancient graves or perform any rituals, he laughed, poking at the fire. The others chuckled, but a chill ran down Maria's spine. She was deeply invested in the stories, and she couldn't shake off the feeling that they might have ventured into something far beyond just a camping trip. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The distant howls of coyotes and rustling leaves created a symphony of natural noises. The friends settled into their tents, trying to ignore the growing unease that seemed to hang in the air. They had planned a hike for the next morning, so they went to bed early, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep, but peace was not to be found. Around midnight, Alex was jolted awake by a strange noise, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from outside the tent. He sat up, listening intently. The sound was followed by what seemed like murmured chants in an unfamiliar language. He glanced over at Maria and Pedro, who were still asleep. Elena, on the other hand, had stirred and was now looking around in confusion. "Did you hear that?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his heart pounding. He unzipped the tent cautiously and peered out into the darkness. The forest was silent now, but the air felt charged, as though the sounds had been an omen. Determined to find the source of the noise, Alex ventured a few steps into the forest, shining his flashlight around. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and gnarled trees, but nothing out of the ordinary. He returned to the campsite, trying to convince himself that it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks on them. The next few hours were spent in restless sleep, punctuated by intermittent disturbances. Shadows seemed to flit past the edges of their vision, and the murmur of voices seemed to drift through the trees. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour. By early morning, the group was exhausted. They decided to investigate the source of the disturbances. As they hiked deeper into the forest, they came across strange markings on the trees, symbols that Maria recognized from her readings about ancient rituals. The symbols seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the group felt a shiver run down their spines. Maria explained that the symbols were associated with a forgotten ritual meant to bind spirits to the land. According to legend, these rituals were performed to keep malevolent entities at bay. The fact that they were seeing these symbols suggested that the ritual had been disturbed or that something had awakened these spirits. As they continued, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew denser, and the air felt heavy with an oppressive force. The rhythmic thudding sound from the previous night returned, louder this time, accompanied by ghostly whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Panic set in as the group realized they were being followed. The shadowy figures they had seen in the corners of their eyes were now becoming more distinct. They were dark, indistinct forms gliding through the trees with an eerie grace. The figures seemed to move closer, their movements synchronized with the whispers that grew louder. The friends tried to find their way back to the campsite, but the forest seemed to twist and shift around them. The familiar landmarks they had passed earlier were no longer visible. It felt as though the forest was a living entity, deliberately disorienting them. As the sun began to set again, the shadows grew longer and the air grew colder. The whispers turned into more distinct voices, pleading and angry. The figures became more defined, revealing faces twisted in anguish and rage. The spirits of those who had been part of the ancient ritual were now manifesting, seeking retribution for the disturbance. In a desperate attempt to escape, the group stumbled upon an old, decrepit altar hidden among the trees. The altar was covered in the same symbols they had seen earlier. Maria realized that if the ritual had been disturbed, performing a counter-ritual might be their only chance to appease the spirits. With trembling hands, Maria began to recite the ancient chants she had learned from her research. The other friends joined in, their voices shaky but determined. The spirits seemed to respond, their wailing growing more intense. The shadowy figures closed in, their presence overwhelming. As they completed the chant, a blinding light engulfed the area. The spirits' cries grew distant, and the oppressive force lifted. The shadows dissipated, and the forest began to return to normal. The group was left exhausted but relieved, their ordeal finally coming to an end. When they finally made their way back to the campsite, the sun was rising. The forest seemed calm and serene, as though nothing had happened. They packed up their belongings quickly, eager to leave the cursed woods behind. As they drove away, Maria looked back at the forest, feeling a mix of relief and lingering dread. They had survived the nightmarish ordeal, but the memories of the haunted forest would stay with them forever. The ancient ritual had been disturbed, and though they had managed to appease the spirits, the forest would always hold its dark secrets, waiting for the next unwary travelers to stumble into its grasp. The night terrors of Oaxaca had left an indelible mark on their lives, a haunting reminder of the ancient forces that still lingered in the shadows of the world. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.